$5,000 a month. Melissa smiled, thrusting an envelope into my hand. Here's how much you've been making as my housekeeper. Now go. The room fell silent, the guests murmuring as my cheeks burned. My son bowed his head in silence. But the next day, Melissa's world began to fall apart, piece by piece. Before we get into what caused this, if you believe that karma always finds a way, subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. My name is Pedro Castillo, and I am 70 years old. Once, I was proud to call myself a carpenter, a man who shaped wood into homes, furniture, and memories. Life gave me rough edges, but I always believed family would smooth them out. My wife passed too soon, leaving me alone to raise our son Daniel. I poured everything I had into him, my time, my strength, my very soul. I worked until my hands cracked, until the smell of sawdust clung to me like a second skin. And for years, I believed it was enough. When Daniel met Melissa, I wanted so badly to welcome her into our lives. She was radiant, with the kind of polished charm I had never known. She spoke quickly, laughed loudly, and carried herself as though the world owed her something. At first, I thought she was simply nervous, adjusting to our modest family. I told myself she would come to see the value of loyalty, the weight of sacrifice. I trusted her smile, and I trusted Daniel's choice. In those early days, Melissa pretended well enough. She would thank me for meals, though her eyes drifted past me as though I were invisible. She would sit beside me at the table, but her phone always stole her attention. Daniel never noticed, or maybe he chose not to. He was so enamored, so eager to please her, that he let small slights slip by. I ignored them too. After all, I thought, what are a few cold glances compared to the promise of family unity? But as months passed, the mask began to slip. I remember one dinner vividly. Melissa interrupted me mid-story, laughing at how my old-fashioned tales were too dull for modern company. The guests chuckled politely, and Daniel just smiled awkwardly, as though agreeing. My chest tightened, but I forced a smile. I told myself she was young, that she did not mean harm. I swallowed my pride because what mattered was Daniel's happiness. Still, I could feel the distance growing. Daniel called less, visited less. When he did come around, Melissa was always there, steering the conversations, deciding where we ate, how long we stayed. My role as father seemed to shrink into that of a background character, present but unnecessary. I reminded myself that every parent must learn to let go, but deep down, I felt something colder settling in, the beginning of erasure. The final straw in those early years came during a family gathering. A neighbor approached, praising the sturdy wooden cabinets in Daniel's new home. Before I could respond, Melissa chimed in with a grin. Yes, Daniel had them installed. He has such good taste, doesn't he? She never once mentioned that I had built them with my own hands, staying up past midnight for weeks. Daniel stayed silent. I laughed it off in front of everyone, but inside, a piece of me cracked. Respect, the very thing I had built my life on, was slipping away from my own bloodline. I carried that fracture quietly. I told myself love would cover it, that family always found a way back to gratitude. I had no idea how wrong I was. I had no idea how sharp Melissa's cruelty could cut, or how deep Daniel's silence would wound. And I had no idea that humiliation was only waiting for its stage, its audience, its perfect moment to destroy me. I still remember the storm that tore through our town years ago, the night the roof of Daniel's house collapsed. Melissa was crying, Daniel looked helpless, and I was the one who stood in the rain with hammer and nails, patching every corner until dawn. My knees ached, my hands bled, but when the sun rose, the house stood tall again. I told Daniel not to worry. That family always came first. He hugged me once, briefly, before running back to Melissa's side. I carried the weight of that night proudly, thinking it was proof of my love. Back then, I worked double shifts at the mill, sometimes sneaking in repair jobs for neighbors to make ends meet. I kept no savings for myself, because every cent seemed destined for Daniel's future. I told myself it was worth it. I wanted him to have opportunities I had only dreamed of. The cost was high, missed meals, missed sleep, nights spent alone in silence, but I endured. A father's duty is to give, even when it empties him. When Daniel enrolled in college, I sold the collection of tools I had spent decades building. Some of them were rare, passed down from my own father. My hands shook as I handed them over to a stranger, but I did it with pride. That money covered Daniel's tuition and kept him moving toward the life Melissa insisted he deserved. She thanked me with a stiff smile, and I believed it was enough. I told myself that love was not measured in words, but in sacrifice. Melissa, though, began to change once they found success. Their first small store opened with the funds I had scraped together, and soon they grew into more. With each new step upward, her laughter around me grew sharper, her eyes colder. She stopped saying thank you altogether. At family dinners, she corrected my speech, mocked the way I dressed. "You really should let Daniel buy you better clothes," she once said with a smirk. Daniel only shifted uncomfortably and looked away. That silence cut deeper than her words. I noticed, too, how Melissa measured everything in money. She loved to brag about profits, about the lifestyle she and Daniel were building. Yet, in her eyes, I was not family, I was labor. She treated my sacrifices as though they were debts I owed rather than gifts I gave. When neighbors asked about their success, Melissa would beam and say, "We built everything ourselves." My name was never spoken, as though my years of sacrifice had vanished into smoke. At gatherings, I became invisible. They would sit me at the end of the table, speaking over me, laughing at jokes I didn't understand. I told myself not to mind, that the younger generation lived differently, but in truth, it hurt to be erased. It hurt to watch Daniel stand beside his wife, nodding along, never once defending me, never once reminding her or himself that none of this would exist without my sacrifices. Looking back now, I realized that those were the first cracks in the foundation. I was no longer the father who built and provided. I was slowly being turned into a burden, a shadow in the corner of their glittering new world. I thought I could swallow that pain. That time would bring them back to their senses. But Melissa's contempt only grew bolder, and Daniel's silence only grew heavier. I didn't know it yet, but humiliation was circling me like a predator, waiting for the moment to strike in full view of the world. There came a time when Daniel dreamed of higher education, and I wanted nothing more than to see him walk through the doors of a university. The problem was, tuition cost more than I could ever truly afford. Still, I found a way. I sold my most treasured possessions, my collection of carpentry tools. Some of those pieces had been passed down from my own father. Others I had hunted down across decades, each one carrying stories of the homes I built and the lives I touched. Letting them go felt like cutting away pieces of my own history, but I did it without hesitation. Daniel's future meant more to me than my past. When I handed him the check, Melissa was already there beside him. She looked at the papers, then at me, with a smile that never touched her eyes. "Thank you," she said, but her voice was cold, rehearsed, as though she were merely signing off on a business transaction. Daniel, though, hugged me tightly, whispering, "I won't let you down, Dad." I clung to those words, even as Melissa's gaze made me uneasy. Years later, when they married, I stood at the altar with my heart bursting with pride. I thought Melissa would finally see me as family, that together we could build a bond. For a while, I let myself believe it, but it didn't take long before I noticed how she controlled the smallest details, where they lived, who they visited, even how Daniel spoke in public. She had a way of making her voice the loudest in any room, and Daniel followed it like a shadow. My son, once strong-willed, began to disappear behind her presence. There were moments that stung sharper than any blade. At their wedding reception, I overheard Melissa telling her friends, "Daniel is the one who truly built everything. His vision is unmatched." Her friends applauded, never realizing that it was my money, my sweat, and my sacrifices that had carried him this far. I stood in the corner, smiling politely, while inside my chest something twisted tight. The whispers spread slowly through the neighborhood. People began to say that Pedro Castillo, once known as a skilled carpenter, was now just a quiet man who lived in the shadow of his son's success. Some even joked that I was more of a servant than a father. Melissa never corrected them. Instead, she seemed to relish it, her smirk deepening whenever I was within earshot. Still, I tried to brush it off. Family harmony, I told myself, was worth swallowing a little pride. I convinced myself that Melissa's sharp tongue came from insecurity, that one day she would understand the depth of my devotion. But each time she ignored me in public, each time Daniel let her dismiss me, the weight grew heavier. One evening, as we sat around their dinner table, Melissa leaned over and whispered something in Daniel's ear. He chuckled, glanced at me, then quickly looked away. They never repeated what was said, but the laughter that followed was enough. I knew, without needing to hear the words, that I had become the butt of their jokes. My son, my only son, had let it happen. I told myself I could endure it. I told myself love would one day outshine their disregard, But deep inside, a hollow space was forming, a quiet ache that no amount of sacrifice could fill, and that hollow space was waiting for the day when Melissa's cruelty would break into the open and expose just how far I had fallen in their eyes. Success came quickly for Daniel and Melissa. Their store expanded, their wealth multiplied, and soon they were being invited to dinners with people who once looked past them. I should have been proud I had poured so much into their foundation, but instead, I found myself pushed further into the shadows. Each time their names appeared in the local paper, each time Melissa boasted about how they had built it all themselves, I felt another part of me erased. My sacrifices, my endless nights of labor, vanished as if they had never existed. At first, I brushed it off. Perhaps, I told myself, they wanted to be seen as independent. But then, the dismissals became deliberate. At their second store's grand opening, Melissa stood before the crowd, introducing everyone who had supported them. Investors, friends, even distant relatives were named and applauded. When my turn should have come, her voice simply moved on, skipping over me as though I had been nothing more than a shadow standing in the corner. The applause roared, but in my chest there was only silence. I clapped along, my palms stinging with every strike, forcing a smile to hide the hurt. Daniel noticed. I could see it in his eyes. He glanced at me once, then quickly looked away, ashamed or perhaps afraid. His silence weighed more than Melissa's cruelty. To be unacknowledged by her was one thing, but by him? My only son? That was a wound deeper than any blade could carve. The moments piled up. At a dinner with their business partners, I was introduced not as Daniel's father, but as someone who helps out sometimes. The room chuckled politely, but the shame burned through me like fire. Another evening, Melissa told a guest. He likes to tinker with wood, keeps him busy, as though decades of carpentry were nothing more than a hobby for an old man with too much time. I smiled, nodded, swallowed the bitter taste in my mouth, and told myself that dignity could survive even this. But the worst came in small, quiet gestures, the way Melissa would place her hand on Daniel's arm whenever I spoke, signaling him to interrupt me. The way she rolled her eyes when I suggested traditions for family gatherings. The way she rearranged seating at the table so I would always be at the far end, nearly forgotten. Each act was small, but together they built a wall between me and the family I had devoted my life to. Neighbors began to whisper. They noticed how Melissa spoke to me, how Daniel stood silently by. "He's treated more like help than family," I overheard one woman say. The words stung because they were true. I had become an afterthought in the very house I had rebuilt with my own hands. The night that sealed the truth for me came at yet another family event. A young guest asked who had designed the sturdy shelves in their living room. Before I could answer, Melissa jumped in. Daniel had them installed. He has such an eye for design. I stared at those shelves, knowing every inch had been measured and cut by my hands, every joint sanded smooth by my labor. Daniel said nothing. The silence was deafening. In that moment, I realized I was not just being forgotten, I was being erased. I told myself to endure, as I always had. But deep down, the weight was unbearable. I could feel it pressing on my chest, night after night, whispering that I had become nothing more than a servant in my own family's story. And though I did not yet know it, Melissa was preparing to show me, before everyone, just how disposable I truly was. The day of my nephew's birthday began with laughter, children running around the yard, and the smell of food drifting through the air. I had brought a small wooden toy I had carved myself a gift I thought would bring a smile. I sat quietly, watching the family chatter and bustle. For a moment, I felt almost at peace, almost part of something warm again. But that peace did not last. Melissa's heels clicked across the floor as she approached me, an envelope pinched between her fingers. Her smile was bright, too bright, like a knife disguised as kindness. "$5,000 a month," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That's how much you've been making as my housekeeper. Now go." The words sliced through the room, silencing every conversation. Laughter died. Glasses stopped midair. My cheeks burned as though the world itself had turned a spotlight on me. The envelope trembled in my hand, heavy with humiliation. For a heartbeat, I could not breathe. My chest tightened, my ears rang, and all I could see was her smirk. I looked at Daniel, my son, hoping for something: anger, defense, even shame. But his eyes dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumped. He said nothing. That silence was louder than any insult Melissa could ever throw. It was betrayal written in flesh and blood. The guests began to murmur. Some hid their shock behind polite smiles. Others whispered behind hands. A few even laughed nervously, as though they were in on some cruel joke. I stood frozen, the wooden toy still in my other hand, my dignity slipping away like sawdust through my fingers. I wanted to shout, to remind them all of what I had done, of the nights I worked, the dreams I buried, the sacrifices I made. But my throat locked. No words came. Melissa tapped the envelope against my chest and turned away, her laughter echoing like glass breaking. Daniel followed her, his head still bowed, never once meeting my eyes. In that moment, surrounded by family, I had never felt so utterly alone. I left the party slowly, each step heavier than the last. Behind me, the music resumed, though softer, as if even the house itself was ashamed. I walked into the night air, the envelope crumpled in my hand, and I understood the truth. To them, I was not a father, not even family. I was a servant whose contract had expired. But as I stood there beneath the quiet sky, something stirred inside me, a spark, a whisper. The humiliation burned, yes, but beneath it, something harder began to form. Resolve. I did not yet know how, but I would not remain their shadow. They thought they had ended me, but in truth, they had only awakened me. That night, after Melissa's cruel spectacle, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my small room. The humiliation replayed in my mind, but so did the long path that had brought me there. I thought back to the years after my wife's death, when Daniel was still a boy with tear-stained cheeks and a fragile heart. I had sworn to myself I would fill both roles, mother and father. I worked from sunrise to midnight, hands blistered and back bent, so he would never feel the hunger and despair I had known as a child. Every ache in my bones was worth it, because I believed I was building a future for him. I remembered the years when food was scarce, and I often skipped meals, just to make sure Daniel had enough. He would ask, "Papa, aren't you hungry?" And I would smile and pat my stomach, pretending I had already eaten at the mill. The truth was, I often went to bed with nothing but water in my belly. My body grew thin, but my spirit held strong, fueled by the image of my son rising above the life I had endured. When Daniel was a teenager, he wanted new shoes like his classmates had. I couldn't afford them outright, so I took an extra shift sanding floors until my fingers bled. When I handed him the shoes, his face lit up, and in that moment, every sacrifice felt justified. He hugged me then, tighter than he ever had before, whispering, "One day, I'll pay you back, Papa." Those words became my anchor, the reason I pushed through sleepless nights. But as time passed, I began to realize that promises spoken in youth are often forgotten in adulthood. The store Melissa and Daniel built stood on the foundation of those sacrifices. The shelves stocked with goods were paid for by the nights I spent bent over a workbench. The very roof over their heads existed because I had rebuilt their house after the storm nearly destroyed it. Every brick, every nail, every plank had some part of me in it. And yet, in the eyes of Melissa, none of that mattered. She looked at me not as a man who had carried their burdens, but as dead weight, a servant overstaying his welcome. Daniel, caught in her shadow. Let that lie grow unchecked. It was easier for him to stay silent than to defend the truth of my sacrifices. As I lay there that night, I realized something painful. All those years, I had believed that giving everything meant I would always be valued. But love built on sacrifice alone can be fragile, easily rewritten by pride and greed. My sacrifices had not been forgotten by accident, they had been erased deliberately. Melissa wanted me invisible, and Daniel allowed it. And as I closed my eyes, the thought struck me with icy clarity. If I had given them everything and still ended up humiliated, then perhaps the time had come to stop giving altogether. I used to tell myself that sacrifice was a kind of prayer, that each hour I worked, each coin I saved, was an offering laid down for Daniel's future. I believed that someday he would look back and see the foundation I built beneath his life. But memory fades quickly when comfort arrives, and Melissa made certain to wash away every trace of me from their story. There was a time when Daniel wanted to open his first store. He had the vision, the energy, but no means. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, calculating every dollar I had, realizing it still wasn't enough. That night, I sold off what remained of my small savings, even parted with my wife's jewelry pieces she had cherished all her life. My chest ached as I handed them over to the pawnbroker, but I told myself it was what she would have wanted. Family came first. With that money, Daniel and Melissa opened their little shop. I was there every day, hammering nails, carrying boxes, sanding shelves. I built the counters with my own hands. stained them so the wood shone like polished amber. I remember Melissa smiling at the customers, claiming she had picked the design herself. My heart tightened, but I let it pass. I didn't need the credit. What mattered was seeing my son succeed. But success changed things. As their profits grew, my presence seemed less welcome. At first, Melissa would ask me to help with repairs, but soon she dismissed me, saying they had professionals for that. The word stung. To her, I was no craftsman, no father, just an aging man taking up space. Daniel never contradicted her. His silence was a betrayal far sharper than her words. I remember another moment Melissa and Daniel bought their first car, a sleek vehicle that turned heads in our small town. They posed for pictures, sent them to friends, boasted about how far they had come. Not once did they mention that I had sold my most valuable possessions to help them reach that point. I stood in the driveway, watching them drive off, the sound of the engine fading into the distance like the echo of my sacrifices being erased. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because I believed love required patience. I stayed because I thought, perhaps foolishly, that Daniel would remember the truth one day. But each passing year proved me wrong. The more successful they became, the less room there was for me. I had turned my life into a ladder for them to climb, and now that they had reached their heights, they kicked it away without a second thought. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit with my wife's photograph and whisper, "Did I do the right thing?" I wanted her reassurance, her gentle voice reminding me that sacrifice was noble. But the frame only stared back in silence. And in that silence, I began to hear another truth, the one I had buried under years of giving. Perhaps what I called sacrifice, Melissa only ever saw as weakness. And Daniel, blinded by her shadow, chose not to see it at all. There was a time when I dreamed of opening my own wood shop. I had drawn the plans, saved for tools, even found a small corner lot I hoped to buy. I imagined the smell of fresh pine filling the air, the sound of saws humming while apprentices learned beside me. It wasn't just about business, it was about legacy, something to pass down to Daniel so he could carry my craft forward. But when his college bills came due, I sold that dream. The money I had set aside for the shop went straight to the university. I told myself it was worth it. A father's dreams could wait, a son's future could not. I never opened that wood shop. Instead, I worked longer hours at the mill, took on side jobs, fixing furniture, and poured everything into keeping Daniel afloat. Each nail I hammered, each plank I sanded, I thought of him walking taller in the world. I believed one day he would look back and say, "My father gave me everything." That thought kept me alive during nights when my body begged for rest. Melissa never saw those sacrifices. To her, I was just an old man with rough hands, clinging to tools she considered outdated. I remember one afternoon when she walked into the shed where I kept what little I had left. She wrinkled her nose at the scent of varnish and said, "This place smells like poverty. Daniel doesn't need this anymore." She didn't see the memories carved into every tool, every piece of wood. She only saw something beneath her standards. Daniel stood behind her, silent as always. His eyes shifted between us, and for a fleeting second, I thought he might defend me. But then he looked away, pretending to study his phone. That silence was a knife I had grown too familiar with. The contempt grew with every passing year. When their business took off, Melissa made it her mission to erase my presence entirely. At parties, she spoke of their success as if they had built it from dust with their own hands. She never mentioned the nights I skipped meals, the dreams I buried, the tools I sold. If anyone asked about me, she laughed and said, "He just likes to keep busy. He tinkers with wood." My life's work reduced to a hobby, my sacrifices brushed aside as though they were meaningless. One evening, I overheard her telling a friend, "Daniel's father is lucky we keep him around. Most people would have sent him to a home by now." The words hit harder than any blow I had ever taken. I had given everything to ensure they had a home, and now I was being spoken of as if I were a stray animal allowed to linger out of pity. I sat alone that night, staring at my hands, the same hands that had built their shelves, fixed their roof, carved toys for their children. They were calloused, scarred, trembling slightly from years of labor. Melissa saw them as useless. Daniel refused to see them at all. But I knew the truth. Those hands had built their entire world, and one day those hands would also take it away. There were countless nights when I worked late into the darkness, long after the town had gone to sleep. My body begged for rest, but I kept pushing, sanding boards, fixing broken chairs, and taking on whatever jobs came my way. Every dollar I earned was folded neatly into Daniel's future. I didn't keep much for myself. My clothes grew worn, my shoes thinned at the soles, but I didn't mind. Each sacrifice felt like an investment in my son's happiness. I told myself that one day the world would see the truth. A father's quiet labor had built a legacy, but instead of gratitude, I found myself being erased. Melissa worked hard to make me invisible, and little by little, she succeeded. When guests came to their home, she would seat me in the far corner, handing me a plate last, as if I were only a guest instead of the man who had built their lives. She would laugh loudly at jokes about old men who don't know when to step aside, her eyes glancing toward me so everyone understood. And Daniel, my only son, would stay quiet, sometimes even chuckle along, his loyalty to her stronger than his loyalty to me. There was a day I will never forget. I had gone into town to buy supplies for a small cabinet I was building. A neighbor stopped me on the street, congratulating me on how well Daniel and Melissa's business was doing. "They've really made it on their own, haven't they?" he said. I forced a smile, nodding, though my throat tightened. I wanted to tell him the truth, that their success was built from my sacrifices, that my blood ran through every nail in their home and every dollar in their accounts. But I stayed silent, swallowing the bitterness like medicine that never heals. The isolation grew heavier. Friends I had known for years began to believe Melissa's version of events, that Daniel and she were self-made, that I was simply the old man they cared for out of duty. They looked at me with pity, offering half-smiles as though I were a burden clinging to relevance. I withdrew more and more, not because I lacked words, but because no one wanted to hear them. Even my grandson, young and impressionable, began to mimic the tone he heard from his mother. He no longer ran to me with open arms. Instead, he would glance at Melissa before deciding whether it was appropriate to sit with me. Each time he turned away, it felt like another small fracture in my heart, proof that Melissa's influence was rewriting the story of who I was. The more I gave, the less I existed. My sacrifices had become Melissa's leverage proof, in her twisted way, that I owed her obedience, that I should be grateful just to sit at the edge of her table. And Daniel, the boy I had raised with my bare hands, allowed it. He let my identity shrink from father to servant, from provider to afterthought. I began to understand then that I was not just being forgotten. I was being deliberately erased. And the cruelest part was that the erasure was happening in plain sight, with laughter, with silence, and with every polite nod from the people around me. I was disappearing from my own family, one humiliation at a time. Family gatherings used to mean something. When my wife was alive, the table overflowed with food, laughter, and the sound of Daniel's young voice asking questions about the world. I used to carve small wooden toys to place at each child's plate, tiny tokens of love that made the house feel warm. But after Melissa became the center of our family, gatherings transformed into staged performances, designed less for bonding and more for showing off her control. Melissa had a way of arranging everything so that I was always on the outside looking in. At birthdays and holidays, she placed me at the far end of the table, close enough to be seen, but too far to be heard. If I tried to tell a story, she would clap her hands to get attention, cutting me off with some anecdote about their latest success. Her voice rose above mine, drowning me out, and Daniel sat beside her, nodding along, never once telling her to stop. I noticed how the children began to follow her lead. They mimicked her tone, her dismissive looks. Once, when I handed my grandson a toy I had carved, he turned it over in his hands and said, "Mom says you just make old things. Why can't you buy me something new?" My chest tightened, but I forced a smile, patting his head as though it hadn't pierced straight through me. Melissa watched from across the room, a satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. There were evenings when neighbors joined us, and Melissa would introduce me not as Daniel's father, but as someone who helps out around the house. The laughter that followed was polite but cruel. I wanted to stand up and remind them that the house they sat in was rebuilt by my hands after the storm had nearly leveled it. But my words stuck in my throat, weighed down by years of silence. I knew that even if I spoke, Daniel would not back me. He had chosen his loyalty long ago. The worst moments were the toasts. Melissa loved to raise her glass, praising Daniel for his brilliance, their family for their resilience, and herself for her sacrifices. Not once did my name leave her lips. Each toast was a rewriting of history, a deliberate act of erasure. The guests clapped, oblivious, while I sat quietly, swallowing my pride with each sip of water. I told myself I could endure it. That family was worth the humiliation. But as the years stretched on, I realized that gatherings were no longer about family at all. They were stages where Melissa performed her dominance, and I was cast as the silent extra, the forgotten old man sitting in the shadows. Every laugh at her jokes, every nod at her stories, carved me out of the picture a little more. By the time of my nephew's birthday, the night she pressed that envelope into my hand, I was already half erased. Melissa had been rehearsing that moment for years, each gathering a practice run and stripping me of dignity. And Daniel, the boy I had raised alone, had long since learned his role. Silence. That silence would echo louder than her cruelty when the world finally saw what she truly was. The more successful Daniel and Melissa became, the more I felt like a ghost in their world. Melissa had a way of bending everything to her will, and slowly, Daniel's voice disappeared beneath hers. He had once been a boy who leaned on me for guidance, who asked me about the future, who swore he would never forget my sacrifices. Now, he seemed afraid to speak without her permission. His silence was no longer just hesitation, it was obedience. I saw it in small things. If I offered an opinion about the business, Daniel would glance at Melissa before replying. If I suggested a repair to their home, he would shrug and say, "Melissa already called someone." If I tried to spend time with my grandson, Melissa would swoop in, redirecting him to another room. Each time, Daniel let it happen, his eyes downcast, his voice swallowed. It was as though my son had been hollowed out, leaving only the shell Melissa wanted. The distance grew until conversations with Daniel became almost meaningless. We once talked about everything: sports, carpentry, even the stars, but now he spoke in clipped sentences. "Careful not to upset the balance," Melissa demanded. When I asked him once if he remembered the nights I stayed up to pay his tuition, his face tightened. "Let's not dwell on the past, Dad," he said quietly, before walking away. His words stung worse than Melissa's cruelty, because they carried the weight of denial. He wanted to forget, and she wanted him to. The isolation became unbearable. Neighbors who once respected me now only saw Melissa's narrative. She told them I was just a man she and Daniel supported, an old widower with nowhere else to go. And because Daniel never contradicted her, they believed it. When people looked at me, I saw pity in their eyes, not respect. They thought I was dependent on Melissa's generosity, when the truth was that her life, her wealth, her home, her stability had all been carved from my sacrifices. I started spending more time in solitude. The shed became my refuge, the smell of wood and varnish the only reminder that I still had value. My tools, the few that remained, felt like old friends whispering to me in the quiet. Each cut, each smooth stroke of sandpaper was a small act of defiance against the erasure Melissa imposed. I may have been disappearing from their story, but the wood remembered me. The grain carried my fingerprints, my soul embedded in every creation. Still, when the nights grew too quiet, doubt crept in. I wondered if I had done something wrong, if giving too much had blinded me to the truth. Perhaps I had made it too easy for Melissa to see me as weak. Perhaps Daniel had learned, from my silence, that it was acceptable to stay silent too. That thought haunted me, because it meant that part of his betrayal was born from my own example. But the hardest truth was this: Melissa's control was complete. She had Daniel's loyalty, the neighbors' sympathy, and even my grandson's fading respect. I was alone, surrounded by people who carried my blood and my labor, yet treated me as though I were a stranger. Alone, but not broken. Not yet. By the time Melissa handed me that envelope at the birthday party, my pain had already reached its peak. Her words were not just cruel, they were the final strike of a hammer that had been pounding against my spirit for years. 5,000 a month, she said, as though decades of sacrifice could be measured like a servant's wage. The laughter, the whispers, Daniel's silence, it was all a performance staged on top of every humiliation that had come before. And I was forced to stand there, the unwilling star of their cruelty. That night I sat in the dark with the envelope still in my hand. I couldn't bring myself to open it. My fingers trembled, not from weakness, but from rage I had never allowed myself to feel. I thought of the storm I had endured to rebuild their house, the nights I had skipped meals to pay Daniel's tuition, the dreams I had sold so Melissa and Daniel could rise. Each memory was a nail driven into me, each sacrifice a scar. And now, to them, I was nothing but a burden they were eager to discard. I stared at Daniel's face in my mind, searching for the boy I once knew. I remembered the way he used to hug me, the promises he made to never forget. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who bowed to Melissa's commands, who chose silence over truth, convenience over loyalty. My son had betrayed me not with words, but with his refusal to speak them. The bitterness spread through me like fire, but so did something else, clarity. For years I had told myself that family was worth every sacrifice, that enduring humiliation was a price I could pay for love. But that night, I finally understood. Love without respect is nothing but chains. I had bound myself with those chains, believing patience would win back gratitude. Instead, patience had only fed their contempt. I did not sleep. I sat with the envelope in my lap, listening to the silence of the house, the faint creak of the walls I had repaired countless times. Every sound reminded me that I was the reason that house still stood. It was my sweat, my labor, my sacrifices that had built their empire. And though they wanted me invisible, I realized something powerful. They could erase my name, but they could never erase the truth. By dawn, the rage inside me had cooled into something sharper, steadier. A vow. I would not lash out in anger. I would not shout or beg for recognition. No, my response would be quieter, colder, and undeniable. Melissa thought she had stripped me of dignity, but she had only given me resolve. Daniel thought his silence had silenced me, but it had only awakened my voice. They believed I had nothing left to give, but what they didn't know was that I still had something left to take. And when the moment came, I would not hesitate. I would take back what was mine, not out of revenge, but out of justice. Out of the truth they had tried so hard to bury. In the days after the party, I carried the envelope with me like a stone tied to my chest. I never opened it. I didn't need to see what was inside. The humiliation it represented was already burned into me. Instead, I turned to the one place that still gave me comfort, the shed. My tools waited, the smell of wood and varnish lingering in the air. I sat at the old workbench, tracing the grain of a board with my finger, trying to steady my thoughts. That was when a different kind of memory stirred, a memory of papers I had nearly forgotten. I went to the small metal box tucked away on a high shelf. It had been there for years, collecting dust. Inside were deeds, receipts, and contracts, all the remnants of a life spent building, buying, and giving. My hands trembled as I sifted through them, not from weakness this time, but from anticipation. Then I found it, the property deed. The land on which Daniel and Melissa's grand house stood was still mine. My name was etched into the document in black ink, bold and undeniable. The house may have been theirs, but the ground beneath it, its foundation, belonged to me. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. For years, I had forgotten about that deed. When I helped rebuild the house after the storm, I never transferred ownership. Daniel had asked once, but I told him we would take care of it later. Later never came. And now, that oversight had become something else entirely, a weapon. A silent, lawful weapon. I thought about Melissa's smirk at the party, about Daniel's bowed head. They believed they had erased me from their lives. They thought I had nothing left, that my sacrifices had been used up like scraps of wood in a fire. But in truth, I still held the ground they stood on. Without me, their empire had no roots. That night, I laid the deed on the table beside me and stared at it until the dawn broke. The paper was yellowed, fragile at the edges, but the words were strong. Stronger than Melissa's laughter, stronger than Daniel's silence. It was proof not just of ownership, but of everything I had built. Proof that I had not given everything away. Proof that I still had something to hold on to. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of humiliation lift slightly from my shoulders. I had not been erased completely. A part of me remained in the very soil beneath their feet, and as I traced my name on that deed, a thought took root in my mind. They had written me out of their story, but I was about to write myself back in. The morning after I unearthed the deed, I felt a pulse of energy I hadn't known in years. It was as if the document itself had breathed new life into me. Still, I knew paper alone meant nothing unless I understood its weight. So I tucked the deed carefully into my jacket and walked into town, to the small law office of an old friend, Jorge Ramirez. We had known each other since our youth. While I built homes from wood, Jorge built his career from words and contracts. If anyone could tell me the truth about the power in my hands, it was him. He looked up in surprise when I entered, his graying eyebrows rising. "Pedro," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "What brings you here? You haven't stepped into this office in years." I laid the envelope on his desk, the deed folded neatly inside. "I need you to look at this," I said quietly. My voice carried the weight of decades, and he must have heard it, because he grew serious at once. As he read through the papers, I watched his eyes narrow, then widen. He flipped each page slowly, carefully, as though handling a sacred text. Finally, he leaned back, removing his glasses. "Pedro, do you understand what you have here?" I shook my head. "Only that it's still in my name." Jorge tapped the deed with his finger. "It's more than that. This land is legally yours. The house Melissa and Daniel live in, the businesses tied to this address, they all stand on your property. Without your consent, they have no right to remain. You hold the ground beneath their empire." The words washed over me, steady and cold. For a long moment, I said nothing. My chest tightened, but not from humiliation this time, from realization. All those years of sacrifice had left me with nothing, or so I believed. Yet here was proof that Melissa's arrogance had overlooked the one thing she could never control. Jorge leaned forward. "If you wish, you can reclaim it. You could evict them, Pedro, or you could sell it. Either way, the power is in your hands. Legally, you are untouchable." I closed my eyes, Melissa's voice echoing in my mind. 5,000 a month. You're my servant. How easily she had dismissed me. How confidently Daniel had stayed silent. They thought I was powerless. But here was the truth. They had been standing on my foundation all along. Without me, their castle crumbled to sand. When I opened my eyes, Jorge was watching me carefully. "What will you do, old friend?" he asked. I folded the deed slowly, slipping it back into the envelope. My voice was calm, steadier than I felt inside. "I'll do nothing yet." Because I understood now. Revenge rushed hot and tempting. But what I sought was not rage. It was justice. And justice, like woodwork, required patience, precision, and the right moment to strike. Melissa thought she had written the final chapter of my story, but she was wrong. I was only just beginning to carve the ending. After leaving Jorge's office, I walked home with the envelope pressed firmly against my chest. Each step felt lighter than the last, though I carried a weight far heavier than paper. For the first time in years, I wasn't powerless. I had leverage. I had proof. And now I understood that patience would be my greatest ally. But if I was to strike, I needed more than one weapon. I needed a record of every sacrifice they had chosen to forget. That night, I opened the old metal box again. Not just the deed this time, but the pile of receipts, letters, and contracts I had stored over decades. My hands lingered over each one. Here was the pawn ticket for my wife's jewelry, sold to pay Daniel's tuition. Here was the bill of sale for my tool collection, the very tools that had built half the homes in this town. And here, faded but still legible, were the receipts from the lumberyard for the materials I used to rebuild Daniel and Melissa's house after the storm. Proof, line by line, of what I had given up so they could stand tall. As I laid them out across the table, a picture formed. It wasn't just numbers and signatures, it was my life story, written in ink and sacrifice. And in contrast to Melissa's arrogance, these documents spoke louder than her laughter ever could. She could mock me at parties, but she could not mock a signed receipt. She could erase me from her toasts, but she could not erase my handwriting on the bills that kept their lives standing. In the days that followed, I began to collect more, quietly, without raising suspicion. I spoke to the lumberyard owner, who still remembered the storm. He told me, "Pedro, if it weren't for you, that house would have crumbled years ago." He signed a statement for me. I visited the mill where I had worked double shifts, and an old co-worker nodded solemnly as I explained. He, too, wrote down what he remembered. Piece by piece, I was building a record not of bitterness, but of truth. Meanwhile, Melissa's arrogance only grew. She posted photos online of lavish dinners, new cars, vacations abroad. She wrote captions about how hard work and vision had brought them success. I watched silently, noting each one, saving every image. The world saw her as a woman of strength and triumph, but I knew better. And soon, they would know too. One evening, as I sat in the shed, organizing my growing collection of evidence, I caught my reflection in the small window. My face was older, lined with years of labor and disappointment, but my eyes carried something new. A steady fire. For the first time, I wasn't staring at a man defeated. I was staring at a man preparing. They believed I was finished. They thought I had been reduced to silence and shadows. But as I stacked the papers neatly into a folder, I whispered to myself, "You've built their world, Pedro. Now, show them the cost of forgetting who held the hammer." The more I dug into the past, the more I began to notice the cracks in Melissa's carefully painted mask. She loved to project an image of control and perfection, but arrogance often breeds carelessness, and Melissa, drunk on her own power, left trails she thought no one would ever follow. It started with the store's records. I visited the small accountant's office that had handled some of their early finances. The man there still remembered me. "You were the one who guaranteed those first loans, weren't you?" he asked. I nodded, though I had nearly forgotten myself. He pulled out the old paperwork, and there it was, my signature. My name tied directly to the debts Daniel and Melissa could never have covered alone. Without me, their store would never have opened its doors. The accountant smiled faintly. Funny. Melissa always said it was her family's connections that made it possible. I said nothing, but inside, I stored the truth like a sharp blade. Next, I found evidence of unpaid favors. When Melissa had expanded the store, she asked local craftsmen to work at discounted rates, promising exposure and future contracts. Many of them never got paid what they were owed. I spoke to 2 of them, men who had once been proud to help because of my reputation in the town. Now, they were bitter. "She never gave us what she promised, Pedro," one said. "She acted like she was doing us a favor. We only agreed because of you." Their statements, too, I collected, each one another nail in the coffin of her false narrative. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from her own arrogance. Melissa loved to flaunt her wealth on social media, lavish vacations, designer clothes, champagne dinners. She captioned her posts with lines like, "Hard work pays off and self-made woman." Yet anyone with eyes could see the timeline didn't add up. Their spending began years before the business turned profitable. I compared her posts with my receipts, with the loans I had guaranteed, with the pawn slips of what I had sold. The truth was undeniable. Their luxury had been built not from success, but from my sacrifices. As I pieced it all together, I realized that Melissa's greatest weakness was her own pride. She thought the world would never question her story, but she forgot one thing: truth leaves a longer trail than lies. And I was following that trail, step by step. One night, as I sorted through the growing pile of evidence, I felt no rage, only clarity. Melissa had erased me from her story, yes, but she had also left behind 1,000 threads that tied everything back to me. She believed she had built an empire. What she didn't realize was that every empire built on lies eventually crumbles under the weight of truth. And I, Pedro Castillo, was the one holding that truth in my hands. The folder on my workbench grew thicker with every passing week. Receipts, statements, testimonies, each piece of paper was another brick in the wall of truth I was quietly building. I handled them with the same precision I once used on fine wood, smoothing edges, arranging them neatly, as if crafting something greater than the sum of its parts. This was no longer just evidence. It was my story, my defense, and, in time, my weapon. I became careful, almost ritualistic, about the way I collected it. I would visit people only during the day, when Melissa and Daniel were too busy with their business to notice. Old coworkers, craftsmen, neighbors, they all had something to contribute. Some remembered my sacrifices with sadness, others with anger at how I had been treated. Each account echoed the same truth. Without me, there would have been no foundation for Melissa's so-called empire. They signed their names willingly, their words becoming part of my quiet arsenal. At night, I stored everything in a locked chest in the shed. The same shed Melissa had mocked as smelling of poverty had now become the vault of her undoing. I almost smiled at the irony. She wanted me invisible, but from the shadows, I was shaping the truth that would shatter her illusions. Meanwhile, I said nothing to Daniel. I watched him go about his life, blind to the storm brewing beneath his feet. Sometimes I wanted to shake him, to remind him of who I was and what I had done, but I held back. Melissa had trained him well, and any confrontation would only push him deeper into her shadow. No, words would not save him. Only consequences would. Melissa, oblivious, continued her performance. She hosted dinners, made speeches about resilience, posted photos of luxury for the world to admire. And each time she boasted, I clipped, printed, and filed them away. I was no longer the silent old man at the edge of her table. I was the archivist of her downfall. There were nights when doubt whispered in my ear, asking if I was becoming something bitter, something vengeful. But I silenced that voice. What I was doing wasn't revenge, it was justice. I wasn't plotting to hurt them. I was preparing to show the world what they had done, who they truly were. And when the truth came to light, it would not be through anger, but through the cold weight of facts. One evening, as I locked away another stack of documents, I ran my hand across the chest and whispered to myself, "Be patient, Pedro. The wood is not carved in one strike, but in careful cuts." I could feel the end taking shape, though I didn't yet know when or how it would come. But I knew this. Melissa and Daniel believed I was powerless. Soon, they would discover that silence had been my sharpest tool of all. The deeper I dug, the more the pieces fell into place. Melissa believed herself untouchable, but arrogance always leaves trails. I followed them quietly, step by step, as though tracing the grain of a board. What I found confirmed what I had long suspected. Their empire was built on illusions, and illusions cannot stand forever. At the bank, I uncovered records that showed how many times Daniel and Melissa had leaned on me financially, even after their business began to turn a profit. There were loans I had co-signed, debts I had quietly paid when Melissa claimed she had handled it. Each page bore my name beside theirs, proof that I had carried the weight of their success on my shoulders. The banker raised an eyebrow when I asked for copies. "Strange," he said. "Melissa always insists they were self-made." I said nothing, but inside, a grim satisfaction stirred. I also visited a supplier I had known for years. He shook his head when I mentioned Melissa. "She never paid on time. Sometimes not at all. We extended credit because of you, Pedro. Everyone knew you were behind them. Without your reputation, no one would have risked it." He signed a statement for me, his pen scratching the page like a final judgment. Another piece of truth tucked into my growing collection. Even their neighbors had stories. One elderly woman recalled how I worked through the night after the storm, patching Daniel's roof while Melissa slept comfortably in a guest room. "You saved that house," she told me. We all saw it. She, too, agreed to write her words down. Every testimony was another chisel stroke, carving away the facade Melissa had built. Back at the shed, I organized the documents into folders. One for property, one for finances, one for personal testimonies. Each stack grew taller, and with it, my resolve. I was no longer just holding scraps of paper, I was holding the truth. Structured, undeniable, and ready. And still, Melissa paraded her lies. She hosted charity events, giving speeches about hard work and determination. Cameras flashed, capturing her in glittering gowns, Daniel at her side like a shadow. I clipped those photos too. Each one was evidence not of her success but of her hypocrisy. The louder she proclaimed her story, the louder the truth beneath it seemed to ring. Sometimes, alone in the shed, I would lay out the folders and just stare at them. My hands would tremble, not from weakness, but from the steady power building inside me. For years, I had been the silent man in the corner, humiliated, erased. But now, I had become the keeper of their secrets, the guardian of truth. Melissa believed she had silenced me. Daniel believed his silence had condemned me. But in truth, both had only sharpened me. The day was coming when their voices would mean nothing, because the world would hear mine not in anger, not in shouting, but in cold, irrefutable proof. By the time weeks had passed, the shed no longer felt like a place of labor, it felt like a courtroom, and I was both the witness and the judge. Stacks of folders lined the shelves, each one a chapter of the truth Melissa and Daniel had tried to bury. Property deeds, bank records, testimonies, photos, receipts. Together, they told a story far stronger than Melissa's lies, and I alone held the key to unlocking it. I began assembling everything into one master file. Each page slipped into its sleeve with deliberate care, like fitting joints into a finely crafted cabinet. It was meticulous, orderly, undeniable. The weight of the folder grew heavy, but in my hands it felt lighter than air. For years, Melissa had painted me as a burden, but here was proof that I had carried the burden for them all along. At night, I practiced silence. I imagined the moment the truth would surface, not with shouting or arguments, but with calm certainty. I would not need to raise my voice. I would not need to demand respect. The papers would speak for me, louder than words ever could. The humiliation she had delivered so publicly would be answered by truth, just as public, just as sharp, but colder like steel meeting glass. Sometimes doubt flickered in me. A quiet voice asked if I was becoming the very thing I despised, vengeful, bitter, consumed by the past. But I silenced it with a simple thought: this was not revenge. This was restoration. Melissa had stolen my place. Daniel had abandoned his duty, and both had erased me from their story. All I was doing was setting the record straight. I was not seeking their ruin, but the truth had a way of burning lies to ash. I sealed the master file inside a weathered leather case, the same case I once carried to work when I needed to transport delicate tools. It seemed fitting. Once, it held the instruments to build. Now, it carried the proof to dismantle. As I slid the case under the workbench, I felt a stillness settle over me, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. For the first time, I wasn't dreading what came next. I was ready for it. Melissa thought she had ended me with an envelope and cruel laughter. Daniel thought his silence had erased me. But neither understood the patience of a man who spent his life shaping wood cut by cut, stroke by stroke until the design revealed itself. And now, the design was clear. The stage was set. All that remained was to choose the moment to open the case and let the truth breathe at last. The day I decided to act was quiet, almost ordinary. The morning sun filtered through the shed window, landing on the leather case under my workbench. For weeks, I had stared at it, waiting, testing my own resolve. But that morning, I reached down, lifted it into my arms, and knew the time for patience had ended. Melissa had made her declaration at that party. I was her servant. My time was up. Very well. Now it was my turn to make a declaration, not with words, but with action. The first step was subtle. I returned to Jorge, the lawyer, and placed the file on his desk. He flipped through the folders, his eyes widening with every page. "Pedro," he said slowly, "this isn't just evidence. This is an entire case, ironclad. You could dismantle them in weeks." I nodded. "Then let's begin." We started with the property. Jorge filed the necessary documents to reaffirm my ownership of the land beneath Daniel and Melissa's home. It was still mine, legally untouched all these years. Quietly, discreetly, we made sure the records were airtight. No transfer, no loopholes, nothing Melissa could twist to her advantage. On paper, their empire now rested on soil that belonged only to me, and soon the world would know it. The next step was reputation. Jorge advised caution, but I insisted. The truth had to be public, not whispered in courtrooms. So I contacted a journalist from the local paper, a young woman known for her integrity. I didn't give her everything at once, only a taste. Receipts of loans, testimony from the craftsman Melissa had cheated, copies of social media posts flaunting luxuries bought before the business was profitable. Her eyes lit up as she read. "If what you're telling me is true," she said, "this will shake the whole town." I leaned back in my chair, my voice steady. "It's true, and this is only the beginning." Actually was said it na. Meanwhile, I carried on as though nothing had changed. Melissa still sneered when she saw me. Daniel still avoided my eyes. They believed I was broken, beaten, still lingering like a shadow in their home. They had no idea that every smile I gave, every nod of obedience, was a mask. Behind it, the storm was already gathering. That night, alone in the shed, I opened the leather case and leafed through the documents one last time. My hands were steady now. Each page was a weapon. Each receipt, each testimony, each signature was a chisel cutting into the false image Melissa had built. Soon the first crack would show, and once a crack appears, the whole structure begins to fall. For decades, I had built and given. Now, for the first time, I was about to take back. Not with rage, not with fists, but with the same patience. I had always carried the patience of a carpenter, waiting for the final cut. The first crack appeared sooner than I expected. A week after I handed the journalist the initial documents, the local paper ran a feature, "The Forgotten Hand Behind a Family Empire." It was cautious, not explosive, but it was enough. My name was there in black and white, proof of the loans I had guaranteed, the receipts in my handwriting, the testimonies from craftsmen. For the first time in years, the truth began to breathe. The town reacted swiftly. Neighbors who had pitied me now looked at me differently, their nods heavier, their greetings warmer. Some even apologized. "Pedro, we didn't know," one said, shaking his head. "We thought Melissa and Daniel did it all themselves." I only nodded, silent, but inside, a weight lifted. The silence that had once suffocated me was now their burden. Melissa's reaction was immediate. She stormed into the house one evening, phone in hand, her voice sharp with fury. "How dare you?" she hissed, waving the article at me. Daniel trailed behind her, pale, his eyes darting between us. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth was already out there, spreading faster than her anger could contain. In the days that followed, more cracks formed. The suppliers who had once tolerated Melissa's arrogance began to distance themselves. A few of their wealthier friends, the ones who attended her lavish dinners, stopped returning her calls. Even Daniel's business partners grew cautious, whispering doubts about the foundation of their success. Their empire had been built on reputation, and now that reputation was faltering. I watched quietly as Melissa scrambled, posting photos online, boasting louder, trying to drown out the whispers. But the more she shouted, the more desperate she looked. The journalist contacted me again, asking for more. I gave her another piece, a statement from the bank, signed and dated, showing the loans Melissa had claimed never existed. The next article struck harder, sharper, and with it, more allies stepped away. At night, I sat in my shed, the leather case beside me, listening to the faint sounds of their voices through the walls. Melissa shouted, Daniel pleaded, their arguments spilling into the night. For years, they had reduced me to silence. Now it was their turn to taste it, the silence of friends gone, the silence of allies lost, the silence that comes when truth eats away at lies. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I only turned another page in my file and waited. This was only the beginning. The first crack had appeared, and I knew. Once wood splits, it never truly goes back to being whole. The shift was gradual at first, then sudden like the cracking of a beam that had borne too much weight for too long. Melissa and Daniel's allies began to drift away, one by one, until the silence around them was louder than any applause they had ever known. It was the silence of abandonment. The business partners who had once praised Daniel for his vision now hesitated to take his calls. I overheard Melissa on the phone more than once, her voice sharp, pleading, then furious. But the more she pressed, the colder the responses became. People didn't want to be tied to a collapsing name. Reputation was currency, and theirs was fast losing value. The social circle that Melissa adored also thinned. Invitations that once came in floods slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. I watched her one evening scrolling through her phone, her perfectly manicured nails tapping harder and harder on the screen as she saw photos of gatherings she hadn't been invited to. For a woman who thrived on being seen, invisibility was the cruelest punishment. Even family turned distant. Cousins who once flocked to their parties with smiles now avoided them, murmuring excuses about busy schedules. I knew why. They had read the articles, whispered among themselves, and realized Melissa's empire was built on foundations I had laid. The truth, once ignored, now traveled faster than Melissa's lies. Daniel changed too. His silence, once a shield for Melissa, began to crack. I saw it in his eyes when he passed me in the hallway, the flicker of shame he could no longer hide. Sometimes he opened his mouth as if to speak, but Melissa's presence kept him chained. His loyalty to her was strong, but the ground beneath him was shifting. Even he could feel it. Meanwhile, Melissa fought harder, posting grander photos online, boasting louder, as if volume could replace respect. But the comments beneath those posts told the truth. People were no longer impressed. They were suspicious, critical, even mocking. The empire she had built on pride was crumbling under the weight of exposure. I stayed silent through it all. I made no accusations, raised no voice. I simply let the truth I had released do its work. It was like watching rot spread through wood once it begins. It cannot be stopped. Their allies, their friends, even their own family saw the decay, and they stepped back to save themselves. Melissa had humiliated me in public, casting me out as though I were nothing. Now she was the one being erased, not by me, but by the same world she had tried so hard to impress. And Daniel, my son, stood at her side as the applause faded into whispers, and the whispers into silence. The silence of being abandoned, the silence of truth doing what I no longer needed to say aloud. When I saw Melissa's mask begin to slip, I knew it was time for the next cut. The articles had stripped away their allies, but the heart of their empire still beat inside that house, the land beneath it, the ground I still owned. For years, Melissa believed she had buried me beneath that foundation. She never realized I was the one holding it up, and now I was ready to let it go. I returned to Jorge's office, the leather case in my hands. He looked at me with cautious respect. "Pedro," he said softly, "are you certain?" I opened the file and pointed to the deed. "I've carried them for too long. It's time they learn what it feels like to stand on nothing." Together, we drafted the transfer. Not to Daniel, not to Melissa. No, I gave the land to a legal trust, a foundation designed to protect families like mine, people who had been forgotten after giving everything. The trust would own the ground. Melissa and Daniel would no longer have control, no leverage, no power to claim it as their own. In one stroke, I severed the lifeline they had taken for granted. At the same time, I ended every form of support I had quietly maintained over the years. The small payments I had covered, the quiet favors, the safety nets, they were gone. For decades I had been their unseen pillar, catching them when they stumbled. Now I stepped aside. Let them fall. Let them see how high they truly stood without me beneath them. The effects came swiftly. Within weeks, notices arrived at their door. Melissa tore them open with shaking hands, her face paling as she realized their security was gone. Daniel asked questions, his voice rising with panic, but Melissa had no answers. For once, she could not spin her way out. The house they flaunted as their crown jewel was no longer theirs to command. Their debts, once softened by my quiet sacrifices, now pressed down with full weight. I watched from the shed as Melissa's confidence cracked, her laughter disappearing, her voice trembling in arguments with Daniel. He still defended her, still clung to her shadow, but his shoulders sagged as the truth sank in. Without me, their empire was hollow. That night, as I locked the shed, I whispered to myself, "It's done." I hadn't shouted, hadn't raised a hand. I had simply removed the foundation they thought was theirs. And as every craftsman knows, when the foundation goes, the whole structure follows. The ripple effects came faster than I could have imagined. Without the quiet lifelines I had always provided, Daniel and Melissa's world began to tilt. Their debts, once cushioned by my sacrifices, now loomed like shadows they could not escape. Collectors called daily, letters piled at the door, and Melissa's confident voice began to falter. I watched as the small cracks turned into fractures. Suppliers refused to extend credit, no longer willing to trust Melissa's promises. The very craftsmen who once tolerated her arrogance now spoke openly of her lies. Some even shared their stories with the journalist, whose next article left little doubt. The empire Melissa claimed to have built was crumbling from within. At home, the tension was unbearable. Melissa's laughter, once sharp and commanding, disappeared altogether. She snapped at Daniel, accusing him of weakness. "You should have controlled your father." I heard her shout one night. Daniel's reply came in a low, defeated voice. He was never mine to control. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something in him, a recognition of the truth, though still buried under years of silence. Friends stopped coming. Neighbors turned their eyes away. The invitations Melissa had once treasured were gone, replaced by whispers. She still tried to fight, posting photos online, wearing her expensive clothes, clinging to the illusion. But the comments beneath those posts had shifted. Where once there was admiration, now there was suspicion, ridicule, even pity. The queen of appearances was losing her crown. And Daniel, my son, grew thinner under the weight of it. He no longer walked with pride. His shoulders sagged, his eyes darted with unease. In quiet moments, I caught him looking at me, as though he wanted to speak, but Melissa's presence always chained him back. He chose silence still, though I could see it was costing him more each day. The final blow came when the trust officially notified them that the land beneath their house no longer belonged to them. Melissa raged, pacing through the rooms like a trapped animal, while Daniel sat in silence, his hands pressed against his forehead. Their empire had no foundation, and the world now knew it. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My work was done. Like a carpenter stepping back from a finished piece, I simply observed. The structure they had built was falling apart, not by my hand, but by their own pride. And the silence that filled the house now was no longer mine, it was theirs. The disgrace spread like wildfire. What had begun as whispers in town soon reached beyond, carried by the journalists' careful words and the ripple of public curiosity. Melissa had always loved attention, now it turned against her. Neighbors who once envied her style spoke of her arrogance. Business owners who once sought her favor recounted her lies. Her name became less a symbol of success, more a warning. Pride built on borrowed ground will not stand. I walked through town in those days quietly, as I always had. But now, people greeted me with respect instead of pity. Old friends clasped my shoulder and said, "We see you, Pedro. We know now." The words filled the hollow space Melissa's cruelty had carved in me. I didn't need applause, but acknowledgement honest and overdue was enough. Melissa, meanwhile, unraveled. I watched her pace in the living room, her phone in hand, calling anyone who would still answer. Her voice rose, desperate, sometimes begging, sometimes threatening, but fewer and fewer voices came back. The social circle she had cultivated so carefully shrank until only silence remained. Daniel fared no better. His business partners pulled out of deals, citing concerns about stability. Former friends avoided him in public. Even his co-workers looked at him differently now, their respect replaced with guarded distance. For a man who once held his head high, the weight of shame bent him low. I saw it in the way he moved, slower, more cautious, as though each step was too heavy to bear. One evening, Melissa tried to host a dinner, determined to prove her standing. Only 3 guests came, and even they seemed uncomfortable, exchanging looks that spoke louder than words. I stayed in the shed, listening to the hollow laughter drift through the walls, and I knew it was the sound of a rain ending. Online, the fall was even harsher. Every post Melissa made was dissected, mocked, exposed for hypocrisy. Where she once gathered admiration, now she drew scorn. Screenshots of the articles circulated, her name tied to words like fraud, deception, arrogance. For a woman who had lived for her image, the destruction of it was a punishment sharper than any I could have delivered. Through it all, I remained silent. I didn't push, didn't gloat, didn't add fuel to the fire. The truth needed no help from me. It worked steadily, like water wearing away stone. Melissa and Daniel had tried to erase me. Now they were the ones being erased, line by line, from the story they had written so boldly. And as I sat in the shed, the leather case at my side, I felt a strange calm. Justice was unfolding not with fury, but with inevitability. Their empire was collapsing, not because I struck hard, but because I had simply stepped back and let the truth breathe. By now, the collapse was undeniable. Melissa's empire, once a towering illusion, was reduced to rubble in the eyes of everyone who had once applauded her. The trust owned the land, the articles had exposed the lies, and the silence of abandoned friends echoed louder than any courtroom verdict. I didn't need to lift a hand. The truth had done the work for me. Melissa no longer strutted through town in her expensive clothes. She wore sunglasses to hide her face, her steps quick and nervous, as though the whispers behind her were arrows. And they were soft words, sharp truths, cutting deeper than she could endure. Every smirk she had once thrown at me was now reflected back at her from the eyes of strangers. Daniel, too, was unraveling. His silence, once his shield, became his prison. The shame bent him low, his shoulders slumped, his voice broken. He avoided me in the house, yet sometimes I caught him staring, his eyes filled with something close to regret. But still he said nothing. That silence was his curse now, as it had once been mine. Inside their home, the tension burned. I heard them argue through the walls, Melissa blaming Daniel for weakness, Daniel accusing her of lies. Their voices rose, cracked, then fell into long, heavy silences. A family that had once turned me into their servant was now devouring itself. And I, the old man they had dismissed, simply watched as their feast of pride poisoned them. The journalist published one final article, tying every thread together. The loans I had paid, the sacrifices I had made, the deceit Melissa had spun. The words were plain, the evidence irrefutable. Melissa's face appeared in the paper not as a woman of vision, but as a warning of arrogance undone. The town didn't just whisper now, they judged openly. Doors closed to her, respect vanished. She had wanted fame. She had achieved infamy. I sat in the shed, the leather case still at my side, though its work was nearly finished. For years, I had carried the weight of silence, humiliation, erasure. Now Melissa carried it, Daniel carried it. The burden was no longer mine, and as the days passed, I knew the final moment was drawing near. The confrontation I had avoided for so long was coming, not in anger, not in violence, but in the cold, steady truth they could no longer escape. I had been their foundation. Now I was their undoing. Soon I would look Melissa in the eye and say nothing more than the truth, and that truth, sharper than any blade, would end everything she had built on lies. The day of the confrontation arrived without ceremony. There was no storm outside, no audience waiting, just silence, thick and heavy, pressing against the walls of the house. I walked inside calmly, the leather case in my hand, my footsteps steady on the floorboards I had once repaired after the storm. Melissa sat at the table, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with defiance. Daniel stood beside her, pale and exhausted, caught between loyalty and shame. I placed the case on the table and opened it. The folder inside was thick, its pages neat and precise. Melissa's eyes flickered to it, and for the first time, I saw fear break through her mask. I said nothing at first. The silence itself was heavier than words. Finally I spoke. My voice was calm, low, the voice of a man who no longer had anything to prove. Melissa, Daniel, this is the truth you tried to bury. I slid the first page across the table, the deed, my name clear at the bottom. This ground is not yours. It never was. Next came the receipts, the pawn slips, the testimonies. Page after page I laid their empire bare. Their hands shook as they glanced at the evidence, each document another nail sealing their coffin of lies. Melissa tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, strained. You think this will ruin us? People forget. They'll move on. We'll rebuild. But her voice wavered. She knew. The empire she had built wasn't just collapsing, it had already fallen. Daniel lowered his eyes, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. His silence was his confession, louder than anything he could have said. He had chosen Melissa, and now he shared in her downfall. I closed the folder slowly, sliding it back into the case. Then I stood, my gaze fixed on Melissa. This isn't revenge, I said quietly. It's balance. For years I carried you both. You repaid me with humiliation. Now, I simply step aside. And without me, you fall. There's ain't to that sack. I turned toward the door, my footsteps echoing through the room. Behind me, Melissa's voice rose in panic, shrill and desperate. But I did not look back. Daniel said nothing at all. The silence between them filled the house, heavier than any words I could have spoken. As I stepped outside, the air felt clearer, lighter. The confrontation was over. I hadn't shouted, hadn't begged, hadn't cursed. I had shown them the truth and walked away. That was enough. Justice did not need fury. It only needed finality. And with that, Act 4 was finished. The carpenter had set down his tools. The foundation was gone, and the house, once proud and gleaming, was left to crumble on its own. The morning after the confrontation, I woke before dawn. For the first time in years, I did not feel the weight of humiliation pressing on my chest. The air seemed clearer, the silence softer. I brewed my coffee slowly, savoring the warmth of the cup in my hands, and listened to the birds stirring outside. It struck me then, this was what freedom felt like. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady, calm, and unshakable. I stepped outside and walked through the yard, letting the cool grass brush against my shoes. The house loomed behind me, still standing but no longer my burden. Melissa and Daniel were inside, trapped in the silence they had created. I no longer carried it for them. It was theirs to bear now. For decades I had given them everything, and they had repaid me with cruelty. Now I had taken back only what was mine, nothing more, nothing less. In the shed, I opened the leather case one final time. The folders lay there, neat and complete. They had done their work. They no longer needed me to guard them. I ran my hand over the papers, then closed the case gently. Justice wasn't about clinging to the past. It was about releasing it once the truth had been spoken. Later that day, I walked into town. People greeted me warmly, not with pity, but with respect. Some shook my hand. Others simply nodded, their eyes carrying the acknowledgement I had longed for but never asked to receive. One neighbor said softly, "Pedro, you showed us all what dignity looks like." I smiled faintly, saying nothing. Dignity wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention. It simply stood when others tried to push it down. As the sun set, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the light fade across the horizon. I thought of my wife, of the dreams we once shared, of the sacrifices we had made together. I whispered into the evening air, "We did it. They can't erase us anymore." And in that moment, I felt her presence beside me, as though she were nodding in quiet approval. The fight was over. The truth had spoken. And I, Pedro Castillo, was no longer the servant in my own story. I was free. In the days that followed, I settled into a rhythm I had not known in years. My mornings began in the shed, not with the weight of secrecy, but with the freedom of creation. I picked up my tools again, shaping wood not for necessity, not to pay someone else's debts, but for the simple joy of the craft. The sound of the saw, the smooth curve of sanded edges, it reminded me of who I was before Melissa's shadow fell over my life. A carpenter, a builder, a man with his own story. I no longer avoided town. I walked freely through the streets, greeted not with pitying smiles, but with nods of respect. The same neighbors who had once looked past me now sought me out. They asked about my work, about my health, about my life. Their words carried no mockery, no judgment, only recognition. For the first time in a long time, I was seen. Meanwhile, Melissa and Daniel sank deeper into the silence of their isolation. Their phones rang less. Their doors remained closed. The house that once overflowed with guests now echoed only with tension. Sometimes I heard their arguments through the thin walls, Melissa's shrill accusations, Daniel's hollow defenses, but those voices no longer pierced me. They were echoes of a world I had already left behind. Melissa tried to keep up appearances, but her efforts rang empty. She walked through town with her head high, yet her eyes darted, searching for admiration that no longer came. Daniel followed behind her like a shadow, thinner each day, his silence heavier than ever. They still lived in the same house, but it no longer belonged to them in spirit. It had become a cage built from their own pride. I found peace in small things, sitting on the porch at dusk, tending to the garden, carving toys for neighborhood children who came to visit. Their laughter filled the air, light and innocent, washing away years of bitterness. One little boy clutched a wooden horse I had made and said, "You're the best, Mr. Castillo." His words, simple and pure, healed wounds Melissa's cruelty had carved deep. At night, I sometimes thought of Daniel. He was still my son, bound to me by blood, even if by nothing else. I wondered if he ever lay awake, remembering the nights I stayed up working so he could have a future. I wondered if regret gnawed at him, but I did not dwell on it. His silence had been his choice, and my freedom was mine. Melissa once told me I was nothing but her servant. Now, she lived in the ruins of her own arrogance, while I rediscovered the dignity she had tried to strip away. The balance had been restored, and I embraced it not with vengeance, but with peace. As the weeks turned into months, one truth settled deeper into me. My war had never truly been with Melissa. She was cruel, yes, arrogant, manipulative, blinded by pride. But she was not the one I had built my life for. My sacrifices had always been for Daniel, and it was Daniel's silence that wounded me more than Melissa's laughter ever could. I remembered the boy he once was, the boy who clung to my hand when his mother died, who begged me to teach him how to shape wood, who promised he would never forget what I gave up for him. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who bowed his head when his wife humiliated me, who stood in silence while the world believed her lies. He had chosen comfort over courage, convenience over truth, and in doing so, he had chosen to abandon me. Sometimes, I caught him watching me across the room, his eyes heavy with something unspoken. Regret, perhaps, shame, maybe even love buried beneath years of silence. But he never spoke. Not once. His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes lingered, then fell away. Silence had become his language, and it was a language I no longer cared to understand. People in town asked if I could forgive him. "He's still your son, Pedro," they said softly. I only shook my head. Blood may bind us, but respect sustains us, and respect, once broken, cannot be glued back together like splintered wood. I had lived too long patching the fractures others left in me. This one I would leave open. Melissa grew bitter in her isolation, but Daniel grew smaller. I could see it in his shoulders, in the way he avoided mirrors, in the way he walked as if weighed down by chains no one could see. Part of me pitied him. But pity is not forgiveness. Forgiveness would mean lifting the weight from his shoulders, and I would not this time. One evening, as I carved a small wooden bird in the shed, I thought of all the times I had sacrificed for him, the meals skipped, the nights without sleep, the tools sold, the dreams abandoned. I had given him everything, and when the time came for him to give me just one thing, his voice, he gave me nothing. That truth cut deeper than any insult Melissa ever hurled. I will not forgive him, not because I hate him, but because forgiveness would erase the lesson. Some silences are too loud to ignore, too heavy to lift. Daniel will live with his silence, as I once lived with mine. That is the balance. That is justice. With the burden lifted, I began to look outward again, beyond the walls of that house, beyond the bitterness that had defined so many years. My shed became more than a place of refuge. It became a place of creation, of giving. Children from the neighborhood started stopping by, curious about the old man who always seemed to be working with wood. I welcomed them in, showing them how to plane a board, how to sand with care, how to watch the grain reveal its beauty. Their laughter filled the air, bright and untainted, chasing away the last of Melissa's venom. I carved toys, small and simple, but each one carried a piece of my heart. Wooden horses, spinning tops, tiny birds, perched on branches. The children's joy when they held them reminded me of my own son, long ago, before silence swallowed him. This time, I gave without expectation. No repayment, no loyalty demanded. Just gifts freely offered because I wanted to, not because I had to. Word spread, and soon neighbors began asking me for small pieces, chairs, shelves, frames. Not for profit, but for memory. They wanted something made by my hands, something honest, something lasting. I worked slowly, carefully, pouring into each piece the dignity I had reclaimed. In those quiet hours, I realized I hadn't lost myself to Melissa and Daniel, not completely. The carpenter in me had only been waiting for the right time to return. One afternoon, a local teacher visited. She asked if I might teach her students about carpentry. "They need to learn patience," she said with a smile. "And no one embodies patience better than you, Pedro." I agreed. The next week, I stood in a classroom, showing children how to hold tools, how to respect the wood. Their eyes widened with wonder. Their hands, clumsy at first, grew steadier with practice. Watching them, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Melissa and Daniel remained inside their crumbling shell of pride. But I no longer wasted my gaze on them. My life stretched beyond their walls now. I had given them decades, and they had squandered it. Now, I gave my time to those who valued it, who respected it, who met my silence not with scorn but with gratitude. I had once believed my sacrifices had been in vain, but as I watched a child run down the street holding a wooden bird high above his head, I knew the truth. I was still building, not for Melissa, not for Daniel, but for myself, for my community, for the future. My hands had always been meant to create. Now, finally, they created freely. Legacy was something I once thought I had lost. I believed Melissa had erased me, and Daniel had chosen silence over remembrance. But as I worked in the shed and watched children laugh with toys made from my hands, I realized my legacy had never belonged to them. It belonged to me, to my craft, and to the quiet moments of dignity no one could take away. I began keeping a journal not of bitterness, but of stories. I wrote about rebuilding the house after the storm, about the nights I worked double shifts, about the sacrifices my wife and I had made together, not for Melissa, not even for Daniel, for myself and for those who came after. So no one would ever again claim that I had been nothing but a servant in my own life. Neighbors sometimes sat with me in the evenings, sharing stories of their families, asking advice on repairs, or simply listening to the rhythm of my plane against wood. They told me I inspired them, that my patience, my endurance, my quiet strength reminded them of what mattered. And I realized something. My legacy was not the money I had spent or the house I had built for others. It was the example I left behind, the lesson that sacrifice means nothing without respect, and that silence, when broken at the right time, can be the sharpest weapon of all. Melissa and Daniel rarely left their home now. The world no longer looked to them for guidance, no longer praised their false image. They lived in the echo of their own choices, consumed by the pride that had destroyed them. I did not gloat, nor did I pity. I simply turned my gaze away. They were no longer part of the story I was writing. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, I stood outside the shed, a finished toy bird in my hand. A child ran up, his eyes wide with delight as I placed it in his palms. His laughter carried across the yard, clear and bright. I watched him run, free and unburdened, and I thought, this is what I leave behind. Not bitterness, not shame, but freedom. I turned back toward my shed, closing the door gently behind me. I did not look back at the house where Melissa and Daniel sat in silence. That chapter was closed. My legacy no longer rested with them. It lived in the wood I shaped, in the stories I told, in the respect I carried within myself. And as I settled into my chair, I felt a deep, unwavering truth. I had not lost my legacy. I had reclaimed it, and now I walked forward without ever needing to look back. Closure did not arrive with trumpets. It came like a soft rain, washing the dust from old wood until the grain showed clean again. Days passed quietly, coffee at dawn, work in the shed, neighbors on the porch at dusk. My life no longer bent around Melissa's mood or Daniel's silence. It stood upright, simple, sturdy, mine. Once, near evening, Daniel appeared at the threshold of the shed. He hovered there like a shadow, unsure of its shape. "Dad," he said, voice thin, "can we talk?" I set down my chisel and waited. He searched for words, found none, then tried again. "I didn't know how to stop it." His eyes were wet. The boy he used to be flickered behind them for a breath. I let the silence sit between us, heavy, honest. Finally I spoke. I asked for only one thing, Daniel, your voice. He lowered his gaze. No excuses, no fixing. He nodded once, turned, and left. I did not call him back. That was closure, choosing not to reopen a wound for the comfort of the one who made it. Some doors do not slam. They settle into their frames and simply stay shut. Melissa never came. Pride held her like iron. From time to time I saw her at a distance, moving quickly, sunglasses on, the world smaller than she'd ever imagined. She passed neighbors who no longer smiled. She stared at houses built on foundations she could not claim. Fame had been her oxygen. Obscurity was her winter. I felt neither triumph nor pity, just distance. I donated a portion of my savings to the legal trust that now held the land earmarked for families like mine, people who give and are forgotten. The deed that once anchored their power now anchored protection for others. That, too, was closure, turning a weapon into shelter. On Sundays I volunteered at the school woodshop. We made small things that mattered: bookends, picture frames, hope. I taught the children the rule that saved me: measure twice, cut once. They laughed when I added, and never build on a lie. Their hands grew steadier. So did mine. One night, a storm rolled in, hard rain, wind like a memory. I walked to the window and watched the house I had rebuilt stand firm against it. Not my burden, not my pride, just a structure doing what it should. I breathed out and felt the last knot inside me loosen. Freedom without forgiveness, people think it's bitterness. It isn't. It's clarity. I can wish Daniel a safer road and still refuse to walk it for him. I can leave Melissa to the echo of her choices without stepping into that echo myself. My life moves forward. Clean lines, true cuts, honest joints. When the rain ended, the night smelled like fresh earth. I turned off the shop light, brushed the shavings from my apron, and closed the door. Behind me, silence. Ahead, quiet, open road. No that, no pleading, no looking back. The final chapter of this story was not loud nor dramatic. It came quietly, as endings often do. One morning I walked through town and realized something simple yet profound. People no longer spoke of Melissa or Daniel. Their names had vanished from conversations, from gatherings, from the fabric of daily life. They had become irrelevant, ghosts, in a world that had already moved on. I stopped outside the hardware store, where years ago I had pawned my tools to pay Daniel's tuition. The owner greeted me warmly. "Good to see you, Pedro," he said, his voice carrying respect. Not pity, not condescension, respect. In that moment, I knew my story had outlived their lies. Back home, the house still stood, but to me it was just walls and timber. I had no anger left for it, no longing, either. It was simply a structure, stripped of meaning, like the people inside it. Melissa stayed hidden, her beauty dimmed, her pride gone. Daniel lingered beside her, silent as ever. I did not enter. I did not speak. Their silence was their prison now. Instead, I returned to my shed. I carved a final piece, a small wooden box, simple and strong. Inside it, I placed the last of the documents, the receipts, the testimonies, the proof of all I had carried and all I had overcome. Then I sealed it shut. That history no longer ruled me. It was complete, contained, finished. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sky turned gold, a soft breeze moving through the trees. I thought of the years I had lost, the sacrifices I had made, and the dignity I had finally reclaimed. My wife's voice seemed to echo in the wind. "Walk forward, Pedro. Don't look back." So I did. I rose, left the box in the shed, and stepped down the path. Behind me lay silence, betrayal, and ruin. Ahead lay freedom, no forgiveness, no farewells. Only the clean break of a man who had endured, who had balanced the scales, and who no longer owed anyone anything. I did not turn around. I never would again,